our next guest is Joshua Gossett. Joshua is the Chief Transformation Strategist for Red Hat. He has spent over 15 years in various enterprise and principal level architecture roles. He's focused on ensuring enterprise architecture decisions positively impact the corporate balance sheet. So he has tremendous experience across many different industries and business models in the implementation of effective enterprise architecture for value creation. Joshua, real pleasure to have you with us today. Go ahead and share your presentation at this point, and I'll let you carry from here.
Sorry about that transition there. Appreciate it, Jose. Thank you. So my name is Joshua Gossett. It's really a pleasure to be here with you, and it's really an honor. It's very humbling to be with a large group of peers and colleagues. So today my presentation is really focused on the value side and the value creation. And so, after several years in architecture, there's been, a lot of technology decisions that are made that, that were great ideas and very sound, but how does that really relate to, value creation and really driving a corporate balance sheet and outcomes? And that's really what I focus on. Today, specifically, I'm going to be talking about, regardless of the architectural decisions that are made, it's really a common paradox that we're trying to attack. And I describe that and start to talk about, elaborate on that. One of the key patterns that exist currently and have evolved over several years is really this concept of platforms. And so I'm going to go into that a little bit. And then really I want to go and show actually some of the results that have come from some of our clients, some of the partners that we worked with. And when we develop and do these appropriately, and show some of the results. So I think it's imperative to say, what was the outcome of these decisions? So if we look at the world we live in today, there's no definitely doubt that there's several different cloud and multiple options out there. I think that this is just the realities of the world we live in. And before, when you had several different types of systems and deployment types, you have a situation where you just drive additional sets of complexity. So I think this is relevant to the world we live in today. As you start to look at that, though, the goals, regardless of what your legacy estate looks like, your current estate, or your mixed environment between public-private clouds, the goal simply remains the same. So over time, you're trying to really support an operating environment that then can support sets of applications. You have different tooling on both sides from an operational support perspective. You have developer tools on the other side. This place in the middle where they meet is really fundamentally where enterprise architecture comes to play. It's critical that we make decisions in this area that allow these two types of paradigms to exist between each other. Fundamentally, though, even as you look at, as systems continue to evolve and continue to modernize, the same paradox is in play. And so when I fundamentally understand this paradox, is you have two different types of dynamics going on in any enterprise in the IT side and in the business. So on one side, you have a driver that says, you must increase the variety, you must increase and scale to customer needs. You must, that the differentiation is what drives value. So what does that really mean? It means you have high levels of variability. So this is on one side of the enterprise environment. And then you also, this is really where you drive, these revenue type activities. And so there's one side of the coin that's driving that. And then there's this other side of the coin where a lot of people live and work in, which is more about scale and optimization, right? So this is really, this is where, hey, we're trying to consolidate, we're trying to centralize, we're trying to get economies of scale. But really what we're trying to do is we're trying to drive operating margin reductions. We're trying to get better asset efficiency. We're trying to do these things that affect the balance sheet, really heavily around like reducing cost. And that makes sense in an environment, but it's directly in the, it's the polar opposite of creating variety. It's decreasing variety to get scale. And so you have these two different buckets. You got business and development on one side and infrastructure and operations on the other. And they're on this teeter-totter, if you will. And this is where the enterprise architecture, comes right in the middle. How do you create effective processes and systems that allow you to manage this teeter-totter where both of these things can be satisfied simultaneously? And so this is where the real value creation in enterprise architecture can sit, and where we see great value creation happening. And so let's talk about this in more detail. We really look at this middle as we have to redefine what this middle is. And so when we talk about, one side that has high levels of variation and differentiation, and the other side that has, economies of scale and infrastructure, you have this thing that happens in the middle. And we like to talk about these in a concept of the different economies that exist. And so you have on one side a kind of a scale economy, that's this variation economy. On the right side, you have the scale economy, which is really built on optimization. But then you have this thing in the middle, which is really what we're defining as the scope economy. So the scope economy is really where you see the emergence of things that we would call today platforms. There's, platforms is a term that's used in several different constructs, but from the purest sense here, we look at this platform as a way to create a set of common interfaces. And so what does that do, right? So it's really about how do we craft well-factored functions? How do we craft and accelerate adoption? How do we create economies that create value without destroying things? How do we increase variability on one side, but then also decrease duplication? And then how do we actually create this as, if you say, like a clutch to a vehicle, and allow it to have high variation on one side and then high standardization on the other, and those to coexist? And so the interesting things about these scope economies and where these platforms play in the center is really, these are things that oftentimes, when you use them, they're not destroyed. They actually increase value. And so that's the interesting part about looking at and being able to apply, patterns and capabilities that actually become more valuable as they're used. And so this is where, platforms, play in the scope economy, and trying to understand how does enterprise architecture sit in this and create an appropriate pipeline, an appropriate roadmap that sees these differentiating being created, but then can create common patterns that can be reused, instead of having to have the value creation team or the differentiating team rebuild the same thing over and over. And then at the same time, being able to hand that over to the operations teams to harden and have them be able to bring their economies of scale and the reliability. So to get more specifics about, these primitives and commons and patterns that we talk about, this kind of narrates it a little bit more specifically. And so we talk about these scales on the right side of the equation. These are your fundamental elements, right? So these are, we often call these primitives, but it's, your network, storage, compute, database. These are often, common cloud patterns. You see these on no matter what your infrastructure platform. These are just the fundamental building blocks. Oftentimes, I'll say that, especially in the cloud provider space, you have a lot of things that are scope-like. So you'll have, native functions. You'll have, all different kinds of capabilities. SaaS solutions, like all different kinds of things, right? That could allow you to utilize those things. But without bringing those in and correctly defining them, using an enterprise architecture to correctly define those and the scope, this is where you have a very hard time actually getting value out of those. But so when you start to talk about in the scope economy, the kind of cloud native patterns and primitives, this is really talking about creating a platform as a set of interfaces, and then being able to actually combine complexities. And so these are things that often happen. A great example here is data patterns. So if you look in situations where you have development teams, depending on where they are in your business, oftentimes they use very common data sets. And so those data sets, like as an example, like a customer record, the more times you can use the same customer record, the more valuable it becomes. These are these are things that can be put into these scope economies and put into these platforms that allow developer and the teams not to have to rebuild those every time they take on a new project. So you create more value, but then they allow the hardening of that on the scope side. And so data is a key portion of the types of patterns that we talk about and how you access that information in a common way. The other thing that we talk about is how do we define, a well-factored function, right? So a function, such, we could think about that as the cloud construct of functions. But the thing about when you actually apply this in your enterprise, these functions have specific environmental context to your organization. And I think that is what we like to talk to quite often, which is, yes, you have availability of these in a cloud or in any types of platform, what we consider potentially platforms. All the clouds have these functions. The problem is those functions aren't constructed in a way that are designed to optimize them for your operating environment. So your operating environment requires enterprise architecture to step in and create a set of functions or patterns or whatever you want to call them that allows them to be a standard for the organization that fits the needs of the differentiation economy in your environment. So oftentimes what I see is this scope economy is completely skipped, and they just open up all of the scale economy. So open up interfaces to your teams, and then all of a sudden you have a worse problem because you are constantly using things with even more variance, and you just drive your costs completely out of, off the edge, right? So then I'm sure that these are where we run into problems like, our cloud costs were exponentially higher or orders of magnitude higher than we budgeted because they didn't come in and shape these patterns appropriately to drive scale, but also accelerate variation. And so these are the types of activities that we talk about that are so critical. And this is where we see the modern enterprise architecture residing in this scope economy and understanding what are the real fiscal outcomes that you're trying to drive on both sides of these. So keeping in mind that in the scope side, the scope economy is the one who's speaking two different languages. They're the ones that are talking to infrastructure and using that cost optimization language because that's what they're driving to, operating margin. And they're also sitting in the Rosetta Stone for the development side, which is saying, hey, I'm bringing you capabilities that allow you to increase variation with stability. And so they're the ones that are now talking in the development language. And so these are really critical to be able to act as that middle ground to create these and accelerate value in both sides, where we can go and create new products and go address new customers and deliver new services, but we can do it in a scalable manner that won't drive costs completely out of control. And so you're acting as that middle ground. And so these are critical concepts. So from my perspective, it's always really critical that, I talked about those kind of what I consider like, there can be very nebulous concepts. So more in practice, I like to show examples of types of patterns that we've encountered that become highly effective. And so this is an example of a microservices pattern that we've worked with before. But this is where enterprise architecture, so multiple architects were brought in to develop this type of pattern. So what this pattern does, this is a CI/CD pattern for a building common microservices. It uses a CI/CD pipeline to do it, but it's really creating a standardized way across the enterprise to build new software. So the important part here is it doesn't actually drive what software you do, But what it does do is it actually standardizes the way that they do source control, the way they do unit testing, some of the security controls. It also standardizes the way that they deliver APIs. It also standardizes the way they do logging, tracing, metrics. These are all really critical to have in place when you build new services, because when you try to troubleshoot these services, if they're not standardized, there's no way to find and trace that needle in a haystack. And so this is an example of a microservices pattern, a design pattern that's used repetitively, no matter what thing you're trying to build. So this allows the development teams and the business, trying to create business value, to go ahead and write code in any way they want. But it allows the support team to be able to effectively support this when you have dozens or hundreds of microservices. They know how they can operationally manage it. And so these create a nice bridge. This is what creates the common pattern to create and drive value out of the scope side. And this is something that I know a lot of companies that do already, and this is just around more domain-driven design concepts. But really what it's talking about is, this is a good example of a scope economy in the sense of that you're building out foundational domains and then you're building out capabilities. So this is an example more of a roadmap perspective. But when I talked earlier about how do you build effective projects and then use those projects to create patterns across complex sets of domains, right? So this is where core enterprise architecture can step in and create tremendous value by looking at across all of these different projects. So let's say these are project roadmap on the top, understanding all the different domains those hit, but then understanding how those projects provide capabilities for the other projects in your pipeline. So if you start to look at this over time, what happens is the actual development and delivery time of each of these projects actually reduces because you've already built parts of those capabilities and made those into patterns for the enterprise and shared them. So in each project, they don't have to go rebuild these complexities. So, I mean, this was built from more of an API construct, but holistically, it works from a data pattern perspective. It works from an integration perspective. It works from just anywhere in your environment where you're going to continue to build new services, new capabilities, but you need to also be able to control those costs. And you also need to be able to harden them and provide the operational capabilities to support them and continue to reduce and optimize costs while accelerating variation. And so these types of roadmaps allow you to do that and to provide value in a different way. And this is what I see as is a prime opportunity from enterprise architecture perspective to go across domains and then be able to look at this more holistically from an enterprise level and say, hey, we're able to extract what makes it our companies. And then we're able to use that over and over again and then drive our value from our development teams, only building net new things versus rebuilding things we use all the time that are core to just the way we operate, like where we house data or how we integrate into things or whatnot. So I showed a couple of patterns. I always also like to talk about what are the results, right? Because it's one thing to talk in a very nebulous way about the broader strategy. It's another thing to talk about examples of patterns. Now it's like, what happens when the rubber meets the road? What does this do inside of a organization? And what does it look like fiscally? And so I think that is critical to making decisions and understanding how the decisions you make affect what happens. And so this is an example of this actual business case that this came from was a client that they have a on-premise solution from a software perspective. They are trying to scale into shift their, there's really an omni-channel type construct here, but it's for a client-facing software that was originally designed. It's a legacy piece of software that was originally designed for an on-premise deployment. It was being modernized because they were trying to shift from on-premise deployment to SaaS on various clouds. And so they were refactoring their code base into the cloud. They had picked one of the cloud providers and wrote into native functions and rewrote several pieces of their capability into that. But what happened is they're a global scale company. So every time that they were going into a cloud, they were having to, as an example, they wanted to enter into the Middle East, they wanted to enter into the Asia Pacific market. They needed different clouds to support those, and they needed certain sets of on-premise deployments to manage and be able to be deployed as SaaS when they originally had like a fat client app. And so really the use case here, if you boil it down simply, it was, how do we create a common way of doing things that allows us to accelerate entering new markets, and then also help us shift customer demand, and then also help us capture customer data and create new value out of that. Because previously, this particular application is fairly data intensive. And so now moving to SaaS allowed them to capture their customers' data and then actually create better models and algorithms that they could turn back around and offer as SaaS offerings. So this was the dynamics of this particular use case. But if you looked at what we actually were able to deliver, we talked about what their investment looked like, but it really talks about they were going to be able to scale and control their costs based on the way their customers were adopting their product. And more importantly, they were going to save $6.5 million in operating costs for every time they tried to redevelop to another cloud. So this particular customer, was taking them a year per cloud. Actually more than that, it was almost 2 years per cloud to fully rewrite their software in every different cloud. And so they were paying outsourcers to do that. And so they were incurring a substantial cost every time they did that. And so what we were able to do is provide a common code structure for them. We were able to provide something that was more modernized and modular and portable. And that particular effort provided an opportunity for them to save $6.5 million every time they were trying to move into a new channel. So they were in 2 channels at the time. They were we could deploy on premise, or we were in Azure. And so they were trying to move to, we need to go to Ali. We need to be able to deploy into different on-premise environments using a SaaS model. Every time they did that, the engineering effort was in excess of $10 million. And so we were able to show them by moving to a common set of patterns and moving their software to a common set of patterns, it allowed them to enter those markets with a common code base. It dropped their app support costs went down substantially because now they didn't have the amount of variation across different clouds because they were using all those native services. And then at the same time, they were able to get additional efficiencies inside of the instances themselves. And so the story goes that from an operating margin perspective, we were able to save them about $124 million. And that was just 5-year cost savings of just deploying and supporting the software that they were selling to clients. On the other side of the coin, you had really the story here, though, was a revenue story for them because there was a large portion of the market that they couldn't reach. And so from their perspective, what we were able to do using a platform effectively and creating effective patterns, we're able to show them how to enter markets. And what that meant to their business was $886 million over 5 years, dollars that they would not be able to capture. So this wasn't taken in, this said, hey, you keep all your same customers. This is just your incremental upside. And so this customer was about a $1.8 to $2 billion revenue business. So this type of revenue uptick for them for incremental was huge. And so this is what effective patterns can do for an organization. And so we were actually able to radically affect their revenue, and we're actually able to optimize their operating costs. So they were getting both on the balance sheet an operating margin reduction as well as a revenue uptick. More importantly, we opened up a new revenue stream for them because now they were able to do the SaaS capture of the data. And so that allowed them to do new sets of products to capture more customers that they never would have been able to reach prior. And so this is what effectively can happen when you use these types of patterns. So this is a little bit different look at that. And so one other thing that I call out on this is there's a certain function that we were talking to them about, which is the reduced in time and capacity was really about some of this concepts of cost of delay. And so cost of delay is used when we talk about, like, opportunity cost lost and some of the capabilities around what are you paying your folks to do today? How many projects can you deliver in a certain amount of time? And if you use these platform concepts, and as they deployed these platform concepts, they were able to accelerate the number of projects that they were able to do in a year. And that equated to a huge upside for them because they were no longer losing revenue. They were no longer wasting time. So they were getting a net benefit from a revenue perspective, as well as an operating margin benefit, because they were getting more effective use of the development staff they had and more effective use of their third-party outsourcers that they were using. So this was tremendous for their business. And so the other thing that was really fun about the results of this project was that we were able to show that this actually showed a 2.2x potential upsell opportunity versus what their current strategy was. So we actually weighted this out as like, look at your current enterprise, look at your current enterprise patterns, look at the current way you develop software, look at the current way you scale operations. If we come in and they put these patterns, what does that mean versus your current strategy if we go this different strategy? And so what we showed them is they were able to accelerate their SaaS mix. So they were able to transfer their customers and modernize their customer base. At the same time, they were able to capture all this upsell opportunity 2.5 times faster, or 2.2x faster. And so this is just a view of where they were saving money in cloud infrastructure and cloud adoption and all these different areas, but at the same time, all of the revenue potential that they were leaving on the table. And so what does that mean from a day-to-day? Like, what does effective patterns bring to the table? So this is a snapshot from an application development lifecycle. And so this is where we see the types of shifts happen. And so when you build effective patterns and you have effective scope, and you've done this effectively for enterprise architecture, this is where we start to see huge shifts in actually the application percentage of time spent in different parts of the environment. So this is particularly on the development side. We see, most importantly, an increase in the capabilities around, focusing heavily on development time and taking out a lot of what we consider like overhead tasks. If we shift time away from, project management, but put that into development, these are really important for you because that's where you're building your variation. And so it's trying to optimize where these teams spend their time across the entire continuum. And that's really important. And then from the application support time lifecycle, this is the other side of it. So this is the economies of scale. And so what did that actually mean after we put a piece of software in production and we used effective patterns? Enterprise architecture was supporting the business appropriately. Then we were able to see the after results, this operating margin decrease. And it's really about shifting lots of time out of support because we were using these effective patterns that were hardened. And so what happens is, because we were building things and doing this effectively, they were able to greatly decrease their application support costs because they're able to shrink in several areas the percentage of time they focus on in these different kind of common areas, right? And so, like I said, this is the economies of scale story. So the first one was the variations increases. This is where we create extra economy. And what does it mean? This really just means we decrease or increase operating margins. So we save you cost. And then lastly, I think one thing that we talk, really passionately about, when I was an enterprise architect and when I was doing architectural work, I was really focused on the technology. And technology people love technology, and we solve problems with technology. That's our expertise. But I think what I really talk about here is I had to realize as I matured in that, and when I was trying to see how do we become more relevant to the business and how do we add value, that IT by itself can't really drive high amounts of things typically for the corporate balance sheet unless they do them purposely. And so if we look at these different things that affect the balance sheet of an organization, IT alone can only affect a very small percentage of the stakeholder value. And so what it told me was it was critical that we put ourselves in a place to understand how the decisions we make drive outcomes. What outcomes on the balance sheet are they trying to drive? And then we can help drive good enterprise architecture decisions because we're aligned with the business goals of the organization. And so then our technology initiatives are in line with our corporate initiatives. And then we also know the stakeholders in the areas that we need to focus on so we can make this really create value. And so I use this chart to show, depending on no matter where you're an enterprise architect, the goals of your organization are going to be different. Public commercial companies have one set of goals, and depending on where they are in their strategy, it could be capture customers, increase revenue, decrease cost. All of these happen in a continuum. Or if you're in a public institution or work for a city, state, local government, it's a little bit different. But I usually think revenue growth is about how to expand services for your users. But at the end of the day, we just have to realize what parts we can play. And then as we're playing those parts, we have to ensure that we're directing them to support the organization to meet their goals. And I think and how they reflect those goals to external companies is through the balance sheet. And so really being mindful about the work that we do, how it affects what results we're driving to our stakeholders and shareholders, that's just really business critical. And so I appreciate all the things we do with technology. It's just really important to be purposeful, and so and that's the story here. So.
Fantastic, Joshua. What a great review of end-to-end of enterprise architecture and strategies and results. So we really appreciate your presentation. A few questions that have come up just to set the stage a bit, Joshua. Tell us, I know that you work across many different industries with different client types. There are questions about the typical profile for your customer, just so that we understand a bit of background. What does your typical customer may look like?
Yeah, I mean, typically I'm working with Fortune 200, Fortune 100 clients is typically my common customer base. Most of those companies, I do a lot of global companies. Large global, conglomerate enterprises. So, I've worked with multiple Fortune 10s. I've also worked with some large state and local municipalities. I'm starting to do some work in Australia right now with some of their with the government there in this kind of civil services side. So I have pretty broad profile, but I would say 80% of my work is with probably Fortune 100.
Very good, very good. That really helps set the background. I'm looking at the questions, and by the way, keep asking your questions, and I'll pick as many as I can. Let me make sure that I have my panel visible here so that I address your questions as they come in. So it was fascinating, your coverage of variability. Really interesting perspective on the paradox of variability as a differentiator early on from a business development perspective, as a variability is a spice of life early on, and later on when you're going to scale, variability is evil because you need to scale. So tell us a little bit about what you have seen in the marketplace on that, on both sides of the variability spectrum, especially with the pandemic and the shifts that a lot of organizations have to undertake.
Yeah, so I mean, a variability is interesting because you've created, I'm dealing with some work with hospitals particularly, right? So their way they capture patients or support patients has radically changed. I mean, they're still fundamental hospitals and their fundamental economics work the same, but the interesting thing that they're worried about is trying to understand how do they manage the still give care, but then how they run their business is kind of reimbursement rates and number of beds and those kind of things. So I think that's probably one of the more interesting use cases that I've seen that forced an industry to adopt varying how they support their customers. I mean, the hospitals they're still customers, but they're really patients. And so I think that I've seen that in telehealth, those type of things. But really the integrations behind the scenes of that is how they work with payers and providers. And making sure that they can collect revenues and how that translates to their balance sheet and those type of things. I think that's been really, really interesting. And so that's on the variation side of the house. I've seen people move really fast just the nature of telework has caused some explosions in certain markets and how they support their clients. It's really, you can look at the stock market and see the people who are benefiting from that. But I think the healthcare one is probably the most interesting case I've worked on of late.
Very much so. So if you look at the last 12 months or so, what do you think are the most important developments or trends in the past 12 months related to enterprise architecture and strategies related to enterprise architecture?
Yeah, I think so. There's always been a push for, when I talked about the paradox, there's always been a push for driving, depending on where the organization is. And IT is usually looked at as a cost center. And so there's always a push more heavily towards the operating margin side, which is, how do we reduce headcount? How do we reduce costs? Those kind of things. I think that COVID and the COVID environment has accelerated those projects. And so oftentimes they have a lot of, processes around modernization and various different elements, which is really focused on driving cost optimization.
Yeah. This is my conference, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
So sorry about that. Is that a question?
No, there was some background that came up on that. I'm not sure where that came from, honestly. but carry on.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I know. So what I've seen, especially this is like in auto manufacturing. I've seen a really hard push to try to drive this, what I consider the enterprise pattern side of really application modernization and consolidation is what we traditionally call it. But there's been it's been accelerated at a huge rate because there was companies that were already basing their cost savings on modernization and consolidation. Like think about app modernization in the sense, I see a lot of that. And so it's how do we go in and take environments, consolidate them, and we have a lot of repeated pieces of software that do a lot of the same things. And how do we take down those portfolios and drive cost efficiencies? And how do we use patterns to accelerate our ability to change? And so I'll give you an example. I'm working with a large global auto manufacturer. The auto manufacturer builds cars based on a schedule. They have one vehicle in their entire portfolio that they allow to build custom. And so they're trying to shift to potentially electric cars. So now what they're doing is they're saying, hey, can you help us normalize our portfolio across all of our manufacturing facilities so we can actually build all of our cars custom? Because COVID showed that people were going to our website and trying to buy cars from us directly, or we usually sell through dealers. And we have no way to do that today. And so if we can take out a lot of this waste of every factory has unique software, we were able to actually offer our customers new ways to purchase from us, but also drop our operational costs substantially. So that was a little bit broader answer than what you specifically asked. But I think that is a really fascinating use case that everybody's trying to achieve, but it's only been accelerated because they see opportunities to support their customers in a better way, and they don't have the capabilities currently.
No, love that. Love that. That's great. What do you see in the marketplace, which is a common miss that people have when it comes to enterprise architecture?
So I think that the common miss is, I see a lot of failures in this, or failures is the wrong word. I see, like, so we talk about adoption of a cloud strategy. So this is really funny. They're like, I look at it as like, hey, we're going to open up this cloud thing, and people are going to be developed, and all this variation is going to be created, and we're going to be able to go faster and drop cost and all these other things. So that sounds like a great story, right? The miss is that they forget the enterprise patterns part. So they have like patterns for like access control, and usually every organization, especially large organizations, have like thousands of enterprise architects, and they're usually isolated, they're usually aligned in a way that is siloed. And so because of that, all they do is recreate common silos inside of both on the platform, and also they don't effectively give these patterns to development. So all you do is create a worse problem than you had before. And so because they don't have effective roadmaps to understand what I consider like the essence of the organization, like every organization operates in a certain way. And so they don't look at that as a roadmap, as an opportunity to provide a common pattern to accelerate the variation. It's just, hey, I'm here to pick technology and I'm in a certain domain. You have to have a view of how does a person use that repeatedly faster, or does it create more friction? And so I think that's the biggest miss. I think, especially, last several years, these cloud, providers, they come in, they dump that on, you turn it on, it becomes extraordinarily expensive. Now you're building the same type of patterns on-prem and trying to put them in a cloud. You have a different operating model. You just create variation both across the operating environment as well as in the development environment, and it just makes you worse than when you started. So I think succinctly, a common enterprise pattern roadmap in aligning that to the projects that your development teams are trying to drive, that is the largest miss. And there's a huge amount of cost savings, and there's a huge amount of value that can be created just by creating that type of roadmap.
That's outstanding. Thank you. That's a very insightful perspective on the market and the opportunities. I have a commentary and a question here from Lydia Spencer, and Lydia asks, well, first she states, as enterprise architects, my team tries to advocate for industry standard third-party solutions that will avoid vendor lock-in so that we can easily port to another platform in the future if needed. However, vendors tend to offer a large price break on their proprietary products, their database, their app server, their AI tools, etc. Our senior management ultimately wants to save money, so it's difficult to advocate for them to spend more to avoid vendor lock-in. Is there a strategy for when to select, when it is a good idea to go with a vendor's proprietary solution?
So I think so. I mean, I think there's certain times, if we went into like, I don't have the time to go into it in this, but there's certain times where vendor strategies make sense. That I always am very cautious about, like, just look at the source, right? So you're right. Those vendors are coming in there and they're making a cost proposition. And this is really common in what I consider like the infrastructure side of the house, where it's like that scope where it's like, hey, we drive more cost efficiencies if we use your stuff. The problem is you missed who's the user of this. I think the way that you advocate for this successfully is you go and you go to the development side and you look at their project pipeline, and then you go in there and you pick. If you look at the delivery capabilities they need, you can go and circle in that roadmap like, oh, they need access to this common data, and they need access. They're going to need these kinds of basic fundamental capabilities. When you see those capabilities overlapping, those are the patterns you need to build. You need to look internal to your org and see what the roadmap in the future looks like and how those capabilities are being repeated. I mean, I'll say this simply, picking what database they use, you need multiple databases because you have different use cases and you have different capabilities, as an example. But if you're not looking at what your organization is trying to do and you're listening to the vendor, you're missing the boat, because dropping the cost actually could impede your ability to drive revenue. And so that's where that's the key here, is go to the development team, look at your development pipeline, work with your partners, and then say, oh, I see you using these things, build a roadmap. And then you go to the developer, you go to these vendors, and you say, these are our core capabilities we need to support for our systems. We want to build a common pattern. Like, can you help us there? Instead of them telling you what to use. It's just, vendors are in it for vendors. I mean, I work for a vendor, so I get it. But at the same time, you have to do what's good for the company. You have to do what your developers need to accelerate their work, because that's your customer. You have to focus on your customer, and they're your customers. So that's what I'd say.
Well said, well said. Joshua, thank you so much for joining us today, sharing your expertise about enterprise architecture, strategies, and your vast experience across many industries. So we really appreciate your insights.
Yeah, thanks, Jose. Have a great day.
All right, that's great. That wraps up this segment of Enterprise Architecture Live. We'll be back up at the top of the hour, and you do not want to miss this. From the city of Calgary in Canada, we have a leader of business enterprise architecture who's doing that work for the city, and will share with us the experiences of doing this in a city and government setting. So very, very interesting presentation from Bilal Siddiqui. And for those of you who are closing the session, provide any feedback you have on the questionnaire that will pop up, and we'll see you back up at the top of the hour. Thank you.